Stanford University.
Well, good evening, everyone. Great to see you again tonight. Last week, when we were about to hear our presentation on the GI tract, I asked how many of you had had dinner before the event. Tonight, I'll be more courteous and not ask you how many have gone to the bathroom, but you will either have just beforehand or sometime afterward. And just think about this. You know, when you think about voiding, it seems like such a simple process. And what I think you're going to appreciate after this evening is how intricate and important our kidneys are to our overall function. Regulating not just fluid balance, but all the electrolytes in our body system, which actually regulates the integrity and configuration of our cells, allows the balance, pH balance in our system to be carefully calibrated so that all of our enzymes and proteins work effectively, helps to organize our blood pressure, among other things, and carries with them, because there are two kidneys, as you know, enormous capacity and redundancy, so that you could actually get down to about a half of a kidney and still function, or even a fraction of a half, maybe one nephron, as we'll hear later this evening, if you're really successful. And so tonight I'm very pleased to have Glenn Chertow, who is the chief of the Division of Nephrology, kidney specialist at Stanford in the Department of Medicine, as our speaker. Dr. Chertow joined Stanford in 2007. He's yet another person that we recruited from another institution, in this case UCSF. We try to borrow the best from them. But he also had his time on the East Coast. He did his undergraduate work at Penn and then went to Harvard Medical School. And in addition to studying nephrology and becoming an expert in kidney disease at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and functioning on the important renal function, he focused on population science and epidemiology as well. So he has a broader playing field of areas of expertise that he is particularly knowledgeable in. We asked him this evening, since he's joined us and been such an exemplary leader, to help elucidate the important balance that the kidneys play in organizing our body systems, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy that. Now, I have a minor confession to tell you. If you can hear my voice, if you're paying attention carefully and you remember the lecture just a couple of weeks ago on the auditory system, you'll know that I'm not speaking very clearly. And that's because if this were an infectious disease session, I would be diagnosed with a significant disease. So I just called in a prescription for myself. You can't do this. But I did, and I know the pharmacy closes at about 8, so at about 7:30, I'm heading off so that I could restore my own body. I'm sure you'll appreciate that as well. So don't mistake my exodus. It's really self-preservation, and isn't just because I need to go to the bathroom. And so, without further ado, Glenn.
Thank you, Dr. Piezo. It's really a privilege, with the exception of the light staring me in the eyes. It's really a privilege to be here. This reminds me, since, as Dr. Piezo mentioned, I'm a transplant of sorts from UCSF, and I still live in San Francisco. So I'm fearful as I drive down 280. It's such a beautiful road, and it's so easy to begin to exceed that speed limit of 65. That light is something I worry about on a regular basis. In any case, I hope that by the end of our session today, you may well be able to, if not call the pharmacy, to prescribe yourself some medication, perhaps call the supermarket or the fridge and prescribe yourself some appropriate fluids. In any case, I think at the risk of potentially jeopardizing my career, I might say that in lieu of the hematologic system, which is, of course, brilliant. I would say that among the things that I'll try to convince you is that the kidneys are the most brilliant organs in the body, with the exception of the brain. But again, I probably shouldn't say that within earshot of a hematologist, oncologist. So I'd like to thank one of my colleagues, Dr. Timothy Meyer, who's a magnificent educator, for sharing a couple of the older-looking slides, which really had some marvelous pictures and beautiful diagrams. So thank you to Tim. So I wanted to give you a context, just a small historical context about the kidneys, because we really don't get, now I'll talk about we as the kidneys, we don't really get as much attention as the brain or the heart or the blood. But we're not only pretty smart, but we're actually really cool. So you've heard about Vesalius, Pasteur, and others. But Virchow, the pathologist who studied cells, of course, made a beautiful statement in, I don't remember the year, in the mid-19th century, describing le milieu intérieur. The stability of the internal milieu is a primary condition for the freedom and independence of certain living bodies in relation to the environment surrounding them. So what I'll try to do today is talk a little bit about the internal milieu and how the kidneys modulate that, and how they can miraculously help us survive in a desert or in the setting of water excess. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the very basic issues of distribution of body water and electrolytes in the body. And for fun, at the end, we'll talk about a couple of interesting cases. And these are the types of cases that we might discuss with medical students. And I think you'll see, based on their complexity and their interest, why they would either very powerfully repel or potentially attract students to our field. Everyone wants to do hematology and oncology nowadays. There are such exciting discoveries, and nephrology is rather unpopular, but I'll try to convince you that that's a big mistake. So I'd like to suggest that modern physicians are surgeons, that is, exquisite surgeons of the extracellular fluid. I'm just going to give you some schematic diagrams for you to think about, because when we think about the body tissues and body water, we don't often think about body compartments. But it's extremely important when we think about how the kidney regulates these electrolytes and fluid, and some of the disorders of fluid and electrolytes that we'll touch on a little bit later. I also would mention that I'd be delighted if anyone asked questions, particularly people on the side of the room, so that I don't have to stare into the bright light. I have about 40 or 45 slides, as I recall, and that gives us plenty of time to be interrupted and plenty of time for discussions at the end. So please feel free to interrupt and ask questions while we're speaking. I'd like this to be very interactive. It's much more fun. This is the room where we do our medical grand rounds, and Dr. Piezo often attends, and our department chair really makes it a theater. It's entertaining and fun, and so I'm not nearly as entertaining as he. He has great glasses with little purple polka dots on them, but please feel free to interrupt. So basically, we have this cellular environment and the extracellular environment. We're going to talk about this a little bit. And in the cell, there's stuff, and that stuff has properties that hold water, and so do the properties of the extracellular fluid. And so these are generally called osms or osmolytes, or depending on who you talk to, tonomoles or tonicity. But these are elements that are dissolved within the fluids, either in the intracellular space or the extracellular space, that are responsible for the composition of the fluids. And the body works very hard to maintain neutrality and you've probably heard the term homeostasis or balance. This is a property of our bodies. This is how we're programmed. The kidneys contribute greatly to homeostasis, but the other organs contribute to that as well. And in general, we work very hard, we, again being the kidneys, we work very hard to maintain electroneutrality, that is the balance of electrical charges, and osmotic neutrality, that is the balance of the stuff that's dissolved in the fluid within the cells and outside of the cells. And in fact, this principle of permeability of fluids across membranes and the permeability of some substances and the non-permeability of other substances is really the foundation on which our cells are built. The energy that our cells use to maintain differences in balance are what really occupies most of the energy, and it's these differences in the electrolytes within and outside the cell that make cells work. So we'll discuss what makes the makeup of the inner part of the cells and the outer part of the cells a little bit later. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of some of the fluids and foods you're going to choose when you go home tonight, or maybe when you came in. So we'll think about intracellular, and you'll hear me use these terms, and forgive me if I use terms that are not well understood. Just interrupt and let me know. I'll try not to. But intracellular fluid refers to the fluid that's within the cells. Extracellular fluid is the fluid outside the cells. And that fluid outside the cells is complex. It's also compartmentalized. So that fluid can be either the plasma, which is the fluid that occupies the blood vessels, or what's called interstitial fluid. And the interstitium is, if you will, the matrix, the infrastructure of the outer cells. And so you have the intracellular environment and the extracellular environment. And in the extracellular environment, you have the blood, or the blood vessels, and the plasma in the blood. The plasma being a mixture of blood and a mixture of electrolytes and other proteins that fill up the blood. And then you have the interstitial fluid, which is also outside of the cells. So they're all in our bodies. You can see those fluids, but they're compartmentalized. And I think often people don't realize actually how little fluid there is circulating around in our blood vessels. And we'll do some of those calculations, but you might be surprised. Does anyone have a guess, say how many liters are circulating in an average-sized person at any one time? 12 liters, 8 liters, 5 liters, 2 liters. Well, that's pretty good. We have a good range, 12 to 2. So, yeah, it's somewhere in between 12 and 2. It's definitely more than 2, except not in a neonate. It would be less than 2, but for most adults, it would be more than 2. It's certainly going to be less than 12. Probably 3 to 5, 5.5 would be about right. But we'll go through some of those calculations. Tim Meyer, my colleague, who's really our division's premier educator, he loves the equations. And I like the equations. I think there are just a couple of equations that really help illustrate some of the principles of balance, which is what I'm going to try to touch on today. I'm not going to get into very complicated equations, though I think for fun and to prove to me that you're ready to call in that prescription for either pretzels or cardboard. that we'll do a couple of exercises later. So this is a diagram. Do I have a pointer? I'm technologically and directionally impaired. So if anybody wants to, turn me around once or twice, I'll not know where I am.
Can you talk a little louder?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. Well, in any case, this. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. This slide depicts what I just described, being the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid, with the extracellular fluid being split among the two compartments, or between the two compartments, the plasma compartment and the interstitial compartment. And we'll talk about the relative size of the intracellular compartment and the extracellular compartment in a moment. Just by way of guessing, who thinks, show of hands, that the intracellular compartment, that is the fluid that's inside the cells, is larger or smaller than the extracellular compartment, the fluid outside the cells, in general? So who thinks the fluid inside the cells is larger? Are you sure? We could do Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Who thinks that the extracellular fluid compartment is larger? There's more in extracellular fluid, more interstitial and plasma fluid. In fact, the intracellular fluid compartment is larger in virtually all cases of health. Occasionally, in a very unfortunate patient, say in a burn unit, in the intensive care unit, the opposite may be true. But almost always the intracellular compartment is larger. So the fluid, as I mentioned, the fluid that's in the cells has a different composition than the fluid outside of the cells, and this is depicted here with a little bit of color coding. So we can see that there's a lot of potassium in the cells. There's very little potassium outside of the cells. There's a lot of sodium outside of the cells. There's not a lot of sodium inside of the cells. So it turns out that the cells create these gradients to allow for their complex functions. And creating and maintaining those gradients utilize energy. And if you look, these are the positively charged ions called cations that are in the extracellular fluid space. And these are the negatively charged ions or anions that are in the extracellular space. And you might recall I said that physicians are the surgeons of the extracellular space. We don't do a lot, generally speaking, since we have access to the blood, the plasma. We're really modifying the extracellular space. The intracellular space then becomes involved because these are fluid, no pun intended, compartments. But this is where we're really doing our business. So you see that the majority of the extracellular anions are chloride. So that's interesting in view of a very important paper published by Stanford physicians today in the Annals of Internal Medicine on the cost effectiveness of interventions that might reduce salt intake, which I think complemented a study we published just last week on the anticipated health improvements that might be gained by a reduction in salt intake. So you see that sodium and chloride, the components of salt, are the main cation and anion of the extracellular space. So if you, before you came in, had a bag of Fritos or Lay's potato chips, you have probably replenished, at least temporarily until your kidneys protected you, you probably replenished your extracellular space of its predominant cation and anion. But thankfully you have kidneys. So let's do a quiz, a pop quiz. The sodium concentration outside of the cell would also be called extracellular, excellent, is approximately 150, 150, or 10 milliequivalents per liter. Okay, raise your hands. 150 milliequivalents per liter. 100 milliequivalents per liter. Round numbers are always good. Okay, how about 50 milliequivalents per liter? How about 10 milliequivalents per liter? What's a milliequivalent? Okay, we can talk about that. Well, this was kind of cheat. It was just to see how carefully you were paying attention. These are milliequivalents. So the sodium concentration is about 150 milliequivalents per liter. It's a little bit less. It's more like 140. You can see there are some other cations. The overall osmolality of the plasma, and the osmoles are the stuff that holds the water. If you're electrically balanced, you have about 150 of the cations, about 150 of the anions. It's about 300. That's the osmolality. It's generally a little bit lower, about 290, but 300 is a good round number. Sodium is about 150, chloride plus bicarbonate. All of you have a box of baking soda in your refrigerator probably. That's sodium bicarbonate. See, all of these things are in your fridge and in your pantry. So we'll talk. I have a slide. I should have put it here just to talk about the milliequivalents and milliosms. Now, just to see where you are with your body compartment sense right now, if you were to infuse a saline solution, and saline is a term that we use for salt in water. So a salt water solution into a person's vein, where does the sodium go? Immediately. And remember, they're fluid compartments, but do they go into the vascular space, into the vascular and interstitial spaces, or throughout the body water? So, who says throughout the body water, number 3? That sounds like one of those all of the above answers that make you feel good in a standardized test. Yeah, that's not true. So does it go into the vascular space, or does it go into the vascular and interstitial space? I see people are saying vascular and interstitial. Why? Are you a couple? Or just friends? Exactly. So I asked the question, does this go into the vascular space, or does this go into the vascular and interstitial spaces? And remember, the salt-rich fluid is the extracellular fluid, the sodium chloride, cation, anion. That extracellular fluid is part plasma, part interstitial. So when you infuse saline or a salt water solution, it doesn't go into the cells because the sodium chloride, does not exist in high quantities in the cells. It's pushed out of the cells. So, nor does it go into the vascular space. So let's imagine that someone were bitten by a saber-toothed tiger and were bleeding from his or her leg, and we wanted to replete the vascular space. What would be the most efficient way of replenishing the fluid in those 3 to 5 liters that exist in the vascular space? Excellent answer. So the answer would be stop the bleeding. But if you could stop the bleeding, but you still needed to replenish the fluid, would you give, and I'll give you 3 choices, and this will qualify you as a junior emergency department doctor. Would you give dextrose in water, a very commonly infused solution? Would you give saline, or would you give blood? Saline. Yeah, if there were blood available, you would probably give blood. Because blood goes right into the vascular space. It stays there. Blood is red blood cells predominantly. So that stays in the vascular space. That would be the most efficient. In contrast, if you gave saline, we've just learned saline would go into the vascular and interstitial spaces. So it's actually not bad. It's reasonably efficient. For every milliliter of, or every 10 milliliters of fluid that you gave, of saline that you gave, maybe 3 of them would go into the vascular space and 7 of them would go into the interstitial space. That's pretty efficient. As opposed to the dextrose and water solution, yes.
So just to help everyone think about it, we might everybody else have the dextrose and water. If that has an interesting.
Right. So dextrose and water, there's water everywhere. And I used the term semi-permeable membrane earlier. And I use that term, that's a very special term to a nephrologist who cares for patients on dialysis, because we're creating semi-permeable membranes for artificial kidneys, because in dialysis, and we'll talk a little bit about dialysis at the end, I noticed in your really lovely text there was some discussion about dialysis, nothing about transplant, at least in that section, but in any case, the membrane, the cellular membrane, is permeable to some things and impermeable to others, which is why we call it a semi-permeable membrane. It is perfectly permeable to water. So if water is infused into the vascular space, it can permeate in everywhere. So in fact, it would be a very inefficient way to restore the plasma volume if one had been bleeding. Giving dextrose and water would give a little bit of extra fluid into the vascular space, but the majority of that fluid would go outside of that vascular space. And this is why when someone is in shock, we often use blood, and there's so much interest in using other plasma expanders to help people in shock, say after traumatic injury. Thank you for clarifying that. So let's take, pardon me?
What's another plasma?
Sorry. No. Yes, you are the light. You are precisely the light. So that's a very good question. So the other question is, what are some of the other plasma expanders? So other things that stay in the plasma space and don't permeate into the interstitial space of the extracellular compartment or the entire total body water, including the intracellular compartment. So probably the most common plasma expander is serum albumin, which is, aside from hemoglobin and red blood cells, there I may have redeemed myself for a moment by mentioning red blood cells. But aside from hemoglobin, if I'm not mistaken, albumin is the most abundant plasma protein. Or sometimes people are infused plasma, actually the non-blood portion, the non-red blood cell portion of the blood, which is plasma proteins, albumin, antibodies, and other materials. And they don't escape out of the vascular space into the interstitial space. There are also some manufactured volume expanders with the same qualities. But the idea is that it fills up the vascular space and it doesn't permeate into the other spaces. So let's talk a little bit about some of these terms that we've been using. I'm sorry, another question, away from the light.
So how many tablespoons of salt would you say are in the body?
Oh boy. You know, that's a great question, and I haven't thought about that. There's a lot. I could calculate that and get back to you. Not as many as in a big bag of Doritos. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure there's more. I'm just trying to scare you. So when we use the term millimole, it refers to 1/1000th of a mole of ions or molecules. A mole is a unit of measurement. When we talk about milliequivalents, it's equivalent to a millimole of charge. So we talked about the stuff, and sometimes the stuff is charged, and sometimes the stuff is uncharged. So let me ask you a question about that. Is sodium charged? Yes. Is chloride charged? Is bicarbonate charged? Yes. Is carbonate charged? If bicarbonate is charged, probably carbonate is charged, yes. Is dextrose or glucose charged? No, exactly. Is urea charged? No, it's not, actually. And urea, boy, you'll really start seeing me smile if we start talking about urea. Haven't you heard that song, how do you solve a problem like urea? How do you cure a rising BUN? It leads on, but in the interest of time, I'll spare you, except for the end, which is if kidney disease isn't causing this thing. So, well, we'll do that later for the encore. Anyway, milliosms are 1/1000th of a mole of particles in solution. So we talked about millimoles. When we talk about something being 1 millimole per liter of glucose gives a 1 milliosmolar solution. Does that contribute any milliequivalents? No. I just know it's something renal. My nose tells me this. If kidney disease isn't causing this thing, then why do they smell like piss? I'm sorry. So let's, for a moment, calculate the osmolality. This is one of Tim's slides. You can see it's gray. How do we calculate the osmolality of a 5% dextrose solution? And the 5% dextrose solution, dextrose in water, is one of the commonly administered fluids in the hospital. I mentioned to you a moment ago that it's not an efficient way of restoring blood loss or plasma loss, but it's a very good way of giving maintenance fluid because, generally speaking, I'm drinking water and I'm hydrating, and that's my maintenance. Do I drink water every day or do I drink brine? I drink water. Now, this is a very common misconception in the hospital, even among house officers and some physicians. We talk about a bag of fluid I'm going to show you. This is a bag of 5% dextrose in water, all sealed. Very commonly administered fluid. One of the quote-unquote maintenance fluids. When we talk about saline, normal saline, and we'll spend a moment talking about that in a moment, that's also often used as a maintenance fluid. And does anybody know what the concentration of sodium chloride is in saline? 0.9, did someone say 0.9? Yeah. 0.9%? That's exactly right. 0.9%. You get a degree. And what does 0.9% mean in terms of the concentration in grams of sodium per liter? So the percent is a convention to describe grams per deciliter, or 1/10 of a liter. So if there's 0.9 grams per deciliter, how many grams are there in a liter? 9 grams, okay. So those are the kind of formulas I like. They're pretty easy. Who knows what the average daily intake of salt is in the United States? How many grams? 2 grams. Those of us who care for patients with heart failure and kidney disease could only wish so well. Guess again. 20's wow. That's a lot. There are people who eat 20 grams of salt a day, no question. But it's on average in the United States now 10. And in conjunction, we'll just take a step away because this is really important to the public health. That along with this unfathomable rise in the average body weight of the United States over the past 20 to 30 years, an unimaginable rise in the average body weight, we've seen an in parallel rise in sodium intake. Does anyone know what fraction of the salt intake we derive as U.S. citizens from processed foods?
Which food?
Processed foods, 20%, 40%, 90%. Do you work for Frito-Lay? It's about 75%. And the Institute of Medicine and a number of other organizations have suggested that our dietary intake of salt should be much closer to about 4 to 5 grams. And for many people, those rare people who happen to be over 45, obese, black, or have any form of insulin resistance or hypertension should probably be even lower, which makes about 75% of the adult population. So in any case, we often talk about when we choose a solution to give, which is the point of this slide. I've gone off on a tangent, but when we choose a solution, we can choose from the extreme of 5% dextrose in water to what's called normal saline or 0.9% saline. And we call it normal because it's of the same tonicity, the same osmolality, the same milliequivalence of plasma. And so that's why we call it normal saline. But you just told me that there were 9 grams of salt in a bag of saline. So a very typical order that a house officer might write to a hospitalized patient of maintenance fluid at 100 or 150 milliliters per hour would give a hospitalized patient up to 3 to 4 to 5 or more times the amount of salt that's recommended in terms of intake, and that's in a hospital. So if we talk about never events and things to avoid errors, this is one of the things that we should be talking about choosing the right fluids, not only when we go home at night, not only when we're taking tests here, but also in the hospital. So we see that 5% dextrose is actually 50 grams of dextrose per liter. There are 180 grams of dextrose per mole, based on the molecular weight of dextrose, and that comes out to 0.278 moles per liter, or 278 millimoles per liter. And you recall that the tonicity of plasma I had suggested to you was about 300, maybe 290 or so, so this is pretty close. So what this means is that if you give dextrose in water, there's enough stuff in that bag that you're not going to run into any problems. You're not going to cause an imbalance or irritate anything that might cause problems. Let me give you a scenario. Let's imagine that you didn't want to infuse 5% dextrose because you were on a diet and you didn't want those 50 grams of carbohydrate. And you just wanted to give water. And you just took sterile water and you infused it into the vein. Would that be okay? How come? You're right. I mean, that's a loaded question, making it too easy for you. I should have changed my tone. Come on, that's great, or something. So what would happen?
It dilutes.
Well, it would distribute. Would it distribute into the plasma, or the extracellular space, or the total body water? Total body water. So you're getting your compartments all down. That's excellent. Yes.
So when I lived in Chicago a few years ago, a marathon runner died from drinking too much water. Is that what that is?
No, but we have a case about that at the end of the talk. Yeah, I'm sorry. So the question was, if I could paraphrase you, that when I was in Chicago, a marathon runner drank a lot of water at the end of a race and died. Is that what that is? And that's another really interesting topic, and we're going to talk about that because that's important in terms of water balance, but that's not the issue that I'm discussing now. Remember I told you about permeability of the membrane? Yeah, no, that's okay. Shame on you. No, what's much worse is, I don't know if you heard about this, but in Sacramento, there was one of those, crazy talk radio stations, had a water drinking contest, and someone was killed. Marathon runner, these things happen, and I'll explain why, and we'll learn about that and why that happens. But just sheer stupidity and malice contributed to someone's death from a water drinking contest. But no, that's different. So we talked about permeability of membranes. So what would happen if you infused water? What would happen to the cells of the body? Exactly. So would water go into the cells? Would the intracellular contents I showed you in that colored graph, the potassium and other intracellular cations and ions, would they leave the cell? Probably not. Not in large quantities. Water would go inside because only things that are permeable would go inside. So dextrose can exchange across that membrane. Water can exchange across that membrane. But if there's just water alone and no other stuff, none of the osms, then you could infuse water, and it's been done by mistake often, and the cells, they burst. And they burst because they swell, because there's free permeability of water across the cellular membrane. The cell then swells, and this can cause major problems. The typical problem that occurs is something called hemolysis, where the red blood cells burst. But all of the cells can burst, and this can be very dangerous. And one of the reasons why we're very nervous about water intoxication, because it can cause cell swelling. So we talked about this. So this is just a picture of a cell, and it highlights the fact that the osmolality inside the cell is about 280, 290. And so if we started with 280 milliosmoles in the plasma but rapidly infused pure water, and we changed the osmolality so that there was more water outside the cells than inside the cells, either the stuff has to leave the cells or the water goes into the cells. And since the water is completely permeable and travels across that membrane, that's what happens and the cell bursts. So we've already gone over this issue about normal saline and 0.9%. And this gives you the answer of about what the plasma and blood are. This is a typical person of 70 kilograms. I don't know, there aren't that many 70 kilogram people anymore. We're all, 85 or 90 kilograms. Yes, you have a question.
I can't but wonder, when you mentioned the cells blowing up and everything, how does that manifest itself in terms of impact on the body? What does that look like?
Well, in this setting where the water could theoretically be infused into the blood, the blood cells are abundant in the vascular space, so they would burst. And that would mean that the contents of the blood cells would escape into the plasma, the non-blood liquid, and what you would see is staining of the plasma. And you would You would probably cause some kidney problems because the hemoglobin inside the cells can be injurious to the kidneys. But you would end up seeing basically a profound anemia because the red blood cells would burst. This is not a very common issue, but this issue of cell swelling in the setting of hypoosmolality is relevant to the marathon runner case and other issues. And certain tissues can swell and can afford to swell a little bit. Red blood cell can afford to swell a little bit. It can't swell a lot. The brain can't swell a lot because it's in a closed space. And, I worship the kidneys, but the brain is supreme. So, if the brain is in a space and it can't expand and the brain is injured, then all bets are off. But this gives you a diagram of what the compartments look like. About 60% of the body weight is in water. I know we think about lettuce being about 98% water. We're about 60% water. And about, as I alluded to earlier, there's more intracellular water than extracellular water, about 2/3 and 1/3. And within the extracellular water, the interstitial space is roughly 6 liters in the average sized person. The blood is about 5 liters, or about 9 liters and about 5 liters. And the plasma is about 3 liters, and the red blood cells account for about 2 liters, which is maybe why the gentleman with the headphones in the second row said 2 liters, because he knew that the blood cells were about 2 liters. But in fact, the blood itself is about 5 liters in a person of this size. So this just gives you a general sense. People argue about whether plasma and interstitial is 1/3 and 2/3 or 1/4 and 3/4. It depends on the body state. There are certainly disease states where there's an excess of interstitial fluid that gets accumulated. Okay, just a quiz. Most of the body water is outside of the cells or inside of the cells? Perfect. So it's like those debates on NPR. You test them at the beginning, you test them at the end, and you're doing great. Boy, the time is really flying. Okay, so the standard 70-kilogram genderless teaching person contains about how many liters of extracellular fluid? So 70 so calculate it for me. 70 kilos. What percent is body water? 60. So 60% of 70 is 42. And what percent of that is extracellular? About 25 to 30%. Right. So that's how you get to 15. And of those 15 liters of extracellular fluid, roughly how much is plasma and roughly how much is interstitial? About 5 and 10. So plasma and blood. So the vascular space and the interstitial space. Okay. A 70-kilogram person, now we'll do this calculation. I don't have, a blackboard. That's great. So a 70-kilogram person has a plasma sodium concentration of 165 milliequivalents per liter. So would we call that hypo or hypernatremia? Hypernatremia, that's right. So when the sodium concentration is high, we call it hyper. When the sodium concentration is low, we call it hyponatremia. Normal sodium concentrations are generally about 140, but between maybe 138 and 143 or thereabouts. But for ease of calculation, if you assume that the normal is 150, someone calculate how much water we would need to give in order to bring the sodium from 165 to 150. Well, so one way to calculate that would be to to determine, and this is one of the few formulas that I use regularly. We're okay. We can talk through it. Thank you. Really, please. It's fine. Oh, thank you. You know all the tricks. Thank you. So if we're trying to assess this would be a water deficit. And this is a common calculation we do in the hospital. Forgive me, I'll try to shout. Can you activate this mic here? So if you take 165 and you subtract 150, that gives you 15. And you divide that by 150. So that's about a 10% water deficit. And so the easy way of calculating that would be, if you know what the total expected body water, which we said was about 42 liters, it would be about a 4-liter water deficit. Now, in truth, in the clinical arena, we often see hypernatremia. It's very common. Very common on the medicine service at an adult hospital. And we often have a lot more complicated calculations to make because often the patients need a lot more water than what they simply need to correct this, because there's usually something driving that elevated sodium concentration. One of the most common reasons for this to occur is very high blood glucose concentrations, out of control diabetes, which causes what's known as an osmotic diuresis. That is, there's a high level of an osmotically active compound that promotes water loss through the kidney. So obviously people are of different size and distribution, so we need to think about this. The management of kids with balance disorders is very different than the management of adults. The management of lean adults is very different than the management of obese adults. And there are a host of abnormalities where there's major excess in extracellular water, what are known as the edematous disorders, which are basically 3 general disease states. One is called congestive heart failure. We usually call it heart failure, but the traditional name is congestive heart failure, reflecting pulmonary congestion associated with poor heart function, either a poor squeeze or an inability for the heart to relax. The second form of edematous disorders, fluid accumulation, looks like what this gentleman's suffering from, which is severe chronic liver disease with cirrhosis. And does anybody know what the third and most important cause of edema is? Dr. Piezo? Pardon me? Well, yes, either nephrotic syndrome, protein losses, and other forms of kidney disease. Kidney, of course, much more important than anything but the brain. So let's talk a little bit about some more fine-tuning balance, and we'll go over a couple of cases, and then we'll leave some time for questions. I think we're doing okay time-wise. So how do we maintain our sodium concentration in the face of drought or plenty? So we know that the cells behave. Thank you so much for coming and for staying. Hope you feel better. So we know that water is freely permeable across the membranes. We talked about that. But how does the body maintain balance? Because I'm sure in a week, any of you with a busy life will have periods of time when you're out in the sun or you're on a long drive, you have no access to water, other times where you have plenty of access to water. How do the victims of the Chilean or Haitian earthquake survive without water for so many days? How is the body able to maintain that? And I'm going to talk with you about a couple of really exquisite hormones. And I call them exquisite because they're fine-tuned so beautifully, and they help maintain this balance of electrolytes. ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, is one such hormone. It goes by the name vasopressin. It's also known to cause vasoconstriction, that is, constriction of the blood vessels. It's a medication that squeezes the blood vessels, or not a medication. Well, it is a medication, but it's a hormone. It's now become a medication to help treat people with very low blood pressures in the hospital. Or antidiuretic hormone, because it prevents the loss of water at the kidney level. And it does so by acting at the collecting duct of the nephron. If you recall your text, there's a beautiful picture of the nephron. I should have pasted it here. It's a beautiful picture, and it shows here, I'll draw it. It shows the glomerulus, which is a tuft of capillaries. These are tiny blood vessels that connect the arterial system and the venous system. Basically, the filtering units of the kidney are made up of live blood vessels. So the idea that we can try to come up with an artificial membrane, this is an exquisite biological system. And then there's something called, you might have recalled this picture, it's much more beautifully depicted in your text. But there's something called, this is the glomerulus, this is called Bowman's capsule. And there's the plasma is filtered. And the proteins in the plasma and the blood in the plasma are generally retained. Dr. Piezo mentioned a disease of the nephrotic syndrome where people spill protein in the urine, and that can be problematic. But what comes through this filtering mechanism is then basically a distillation of the plasma. So the proteins in the blood and the important things that you don't want to lose are generally kept. And then everything that's dissolved in the solute, that's dissolved in the plasma water, gets filtered. And then it gets processed. And it's really a magnificent system. This is called the proximal tubule. This is the workhorse of the kidney. This is where most of the important stuff that gets dissolved in the plasma water, but we don't want to lose, like amino acids. So proteins are big, and they don't pass through the filter. But amino acids are small. The building blocks of the protein are small.
Microphone.
I'm sorry. And the amino acids are small. Dextrose is small. The electrolytes are small. So they go through the glomerulus. They tend to be reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. But then this filtrate, which is sort of, you might call it pre-urine. It's going to become the urine. But the plasma filtrate goes through a series of processing steps where there are mechanisms to modify the concentration of materials within the filtrate so as to keep balance. So among those is that the body reabsorbs sodium. So what would happen if we didn't, boy, if you get this, I'll be so proud. What would happen if the kidneys didn't reabsorb the sodium? You'd have to eat even more salt, imagine that. Yeah, so what would happen is that whole extracellular space, that whole extracellular water we've been talking about would be depleted, including the interstitial space and the vascular space. And what would happen if our vascular space were depleted of, it would be a little bit different than bleeding. We would just become desiccated. Our blood cells would stay in the blood vessels, but all the other material in the blood vessels would come out. So the blood vessels are 40%, the plasma is 40% blood and 60% other stuff, including the filtrate, which has an osmolality that's roughly what?
300.
Yeah, excellent, 300. So if we don't reabsorb most of our sodium in the kidney, we would go into shock. Now, what would happen if we didn't excrete any of our sodium? What would happen if we ate a bag of Doritos, but every 5 minutes? but our kidneys didn't eliminate sodium when we had sodium in excess. Exactly. So we would swell up. And our extracellular compartment would expand, both the interstitial area and the vascular area. So we'll see. Boy, you guys are really good. So what would happen if the vascular space were to expand abruptly? What might you see on a physical examination? Blood pressure, I heard it. Excellent. The blood pressure would go up. What might you see if the interstitial, the supporting tissue, the infrastructure were to swell up? What would you see? Edema. Who said edema? Raise your hand. You must love the kidneys. Thank you. Right. So the filtrate gets processed, and it's really in this, what's called the collecting duct, where all of the fine-tuning of water balance is held. And there's this exquisite hormone called ADH, or vasopressin, that basically serves to allow water to be reabsorbed. So if I'm an idiot and I go to some radio station in Sacramento and I drink a gallon of water, do I want my kidneys to reabsorb that water, or do I want my kidneys to excrete that water? Excrete that water, exactly. And so what happens to the color of your urine when you sleep overnight or hike in the summer heat? Does it get darkened? Okay, so it gets darker. And why is that? And why is it concentrated? What hormone is activated? Vasopressin. Oh, these guys are great. They're fabulous. What happens to the color of your urine when you drink 8 glasses of water or a 6-pack of beer? It lightens. So the ADH is suppressed, exactly. And then we're going to get to your marathon case. We're going to get there. So ADH is produced in the posterior pituitary gland. Does anybody know where that gland resides? It's in the brain, right, in the base of the brain, in response to osmotic effects. And so we've talked about that. The higher the osmolality, that results in an increase in ADH secretion, so that the kidney tells a signal to the collecting duct cells, okay, open up the water channels, let the water come in. Okay? When the osmolality drops down, it says, shut off those water channels and don't let the water in. Let it go down the sink or down the toilet. But interestingly, there are a variety of pulmonary and central nervous system or lung and brain diseases that can also elicit increases in ADH, which is something interesting. We use such terrible terminology in medicine, but it causes something called the syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, or SIADH. And also low pressure. When the body has low blood pressure, there's a receptor around, it's called the carotid body. It's up in the neck near the carotid arteries. And it's a pressure sensor. You know, our bodies are fabulous. They have so many kind of safety devices. If only Toyota could, could design cars that are as precise and have so many safety nets. So why do you think the body would be designed in such a way that we would have baroreceptors that would activate ADH in the event of low blood pressure? Who said saber-toothed tiger bite? Excellent. What's your name?
I'm Cynthia.
Pardon me?
Cynthia.
Hi, Cynthia. Thank you. Saber-toothed tigers play a big role in medicine, but they really do. And we often use saber-toothed tigers to describe hormonal responses that occur. And you may have heard, I don't know, have they had their endocrine lecture yet? Okay. Well, I'll take just a moment. There's something called, there are two autonomic nervous systems, two automatic nervous systems that work without the volitional control of our brain. And those are the sympathetic nervous system, which modulates the fight or flight response. That's the saber-toothed tiger part. And the other is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the mellow, cool, Barry White nervous system. So when the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, the kidneys are so smart. They don't even need the brain to tell them what to do. It's just automatic. So when the sympathetic nervous system activates, it causes a variety of hormonal responses. And it turns out that what those hormonal responses do are tells the kidneys, absorb all that sodium. Don't let the sodium go. Hold the sodium. Now, we've talked about this already. You'd want to hold on to sodium if you were bitten by a saber-toothed tiger. So who saves you when you're bitten by a saber-toothed tiger? Yeah, ultimately it's the kidneys. Your adrenal glands save you because they produce the epinephrine or adrenaline. So without the adrenal glands, the kidneys would just, be waiting and waiting and waiting. But ultimately, the kidneys save you because they prevent you from losing any more sodium, assuming that you can get the blood, the bleeding to stop. So all those signals when they're shocked are to reabsorb sodium. And we talked about this when we started, that if we need to replenish the plasma volume, we would give blood, saline, or water, right? And we said we would give blood if that were a preference, or we would give saline. That would be the best second choice because that's what goes to the extracellular fluid, and it's more efficiently distributed into the plasma volume than something that gets distributed to the total body water. So this, pathetic little baroreceptor, is just, it doesn't know what to do other than, it's sort of a safety net after the saber-toothed tiger-induced sympathetic nervous system response, which turns on all the sodium retention. And this baroreceptor is turning on ADH because, when you're in a bind, you want to absorb everything you can, even though you want to absorb sodium for sure, but you'll try to absorb water also. So these are the two main pathological states where you see ADH in excess, where there's lung disease or central nervous system disease, or if there's low blood pressure. Okay? And so, I'm sorry, question.
There's a saber-toothed tiger kind of called PMS, and I'm just wondering, looking at the response of water gain around the time of your period, and then also blood loss, is there something that's going on in there trying to...
Wow, so that's a great question. I have to tell you, I'm not that old, but in my 20 years or so of being a physician, I've never responded to a question quite like that. So I've never heard of PMS described as a saber-toothed tiger, but I have a 12-year-old daughter, so I know. Anyway, so that's a really good question because that's, one of those things in medicine, and if you watch House, you'll hear all these silly terms that we use in medicine. It's really a language all of its own, but we say, oh, that's true, and unrelated. So they're true. So PMS is a saber-toothed tiger, true. There's blood loss in with menses, that's true. There's fluid retention, that's true. They're true, and unrelated. So just briefly, the blood loss that typically occurs with menses is not massive. So the kind of response, the sympathetic, overdrive, massive, fight or flight response occurs when there's massive blood loss or a massive trauma or stress. And not to diminish menses or PMS for that matter, but the blood loss is not of a sufficient volume to induce those mechanisms.
Why do you get the water weight then?
So the water weight relates to the effects of and these are great. I hope that you'll ask lots of these questions when we finish up, because these are great questions. The water accumulation, or the fluid accumulation, now I'm going to test you, is that a vascular, intracellular, or interstitial fluid that accumulates around your menses?
It only accumulates in your face and ankles.
It's interstitial. But that's okay. Anyway, the hormones, the progestins mostly, the progestins actually have, it's very interesting, the progestins are related to another, so the progestins are made by the ovary, predominantly. They're made in small quantities by the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland also makes a variety of hormones. The adrenal medulla makes epinephrine or adrenaline, but the adrenal cortex makes glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. You might say mineralocorticoids, interesting, minerals. That sounds like what we've been talking about. So there's a hormone known as aldosterone that's made in the adrenal cortex that promotes salt retention. And the progestins that are in excess around the time of menses cross-react with some of the mineralocorticoid receptors, and they actually cause sodium retention here in the distal portion of the nephron. So that's very common, and that's because the kidneys, now you can blame the kidneys for your fluid retention. It's the kidneys' fault. So any other questions before I move on to another exquisite hormone? Yes, question.
It's kind of piggybacking off of what she was asking, but when you are under stress, just normal stress, that stress supposedly is related to, or high blood pressure is related to stress. Is the stress and the high blood pressure causing the sodium retention, which is causing the high blood pressure?
Wow. That's a great question, and a number of the young scientists in our division are trying to understand the mechanism of hypertension. Hypertension is incredible, or high blood pressure. Hypertension is incredibly common, and even after centuries of understanding a little bit about hypertension and decades of understanding a lot about hypertension, we don't really know in all cases why it develops. Certainly I would say that a sort of continuous high stress situation with high levels of epinephrine would promote sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule. It would also promote diabetes, and which diabetes can contribute to hypertension in other ways. It can promote obesity. It can promote sleep apnea. It can promote stress can do a lot of bad things that can then interact and cause hypertension. Whether there's a big component of renal salt retention in the stress-associated hypertension, I'm not sure. Probably in some patients, probably not in others. It's a great question. And I mean, it speaks to how this is a really common disease, and we don't quite really understand. Why is it, for instance, that when someone loses 10 pounds, they can see a 20-point drop in their blood pressure? We don't understand that. Incredibly common. You see your doctor notices that your blood pressure is high and says, you really should lose a little weight. Perfectly reasonable, sensible, healthy recommendation. But what's the mechanism of that weight loss? One of our colleagues, Vivek Bala, hope he doesn't hear this or see this, but he's submitting some grants to try to study the association between obesity and hypertension, understanding the molecular mechanism using mice and knockout mice and things like that. Any other questions before we go to exquisite hormone number 2? And there are a whole host of hormones. I don't want to diminish any of the endocrine discussions that you'll have. But this is really more about electrolytes, so they can talk about diabetes and other things. But there's something called parathyroid hormone, which is a great source of confusion because it has nothing to do with the thyroid. Everybody knows about the thyroid. Where is the thyroid located? In the neck. So where is the parathyroid located? Around or near the thyroid, and that's why it's called parathyroid. But it has nothing at all to do with the thyroid. That confuses people terribly. There are 4 glands located atop the thyroid. They're responsible for maintaining stable ionized calcium concentrations, which are important to the function of all living cells. So we've talked a lot about sodium and water, a little bit about potassium. We haven't talked about calcium. But calcium is another one of the really important electrolytes that our body keeps within a very, very, very narrow range. Parathyroid hormone also helps to maintain serum phosphorus concentrations by modulating the kidney's handling of phosphorus. And this is, again, another story of, like we talked about with the water, in the desert or in plenty. Our kidneys have to manage a completely varying environment, varying diet. The kidneys and the liver, to that, for that matter, have to manage vast differences. And imagine what we were like before we had, grazing, eating behaviors, when we would, be foodless for several days, and then we'd feast on a beast. And we'd have, 0 phosphorus intake for 3 days, and then we'd have an enormous amount of phosphorus intake for 3 hours. And how do we maintain phosphorus balance in the state of that? And the fact that our kidneys can do that, have you been convinced that the kidneys are the smartest organs after the brain? So phosphorus, just to spend a minute, because it's a couple of my friends are looking toward getting the FDA to have phosphorus labeled on foodstuffs, because it isn't, and for people with kidney disease it really matters. But it's an important component of bone. Basically, calcium and phosphorus are important components of bone mineralization. It's also an important component of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which is the molecule that's responsible for energy metabolism in cells. So basically, you need phosphorus about as much as you need all these other important things I've talked to you about. It's present in the diet, mostly in protein sources, and especially in dairy products. So I'm sure you've all heard people talk about drink milk, it's good for your bones. Well, it's not only the calcium, it's also because there's phosphorus. Yes, question?
Speaking of things to drink, you've got a nice trough that with a Diet Coke can.
Yes.
Could you speak to the effect of drinking phosphoric acid?
It's a very interesting question also. There is phosphorus in cola drinks. And so for someone, like most of us in the audience, I presume, who have ample kidney function, there's really no consequence in terms of the phosphorus. For someone with kidney disease who has impaired phosphorus excretion, there could be consequences. And since this is a totally non-nutritive source of phosphorus, it would be a shame for someone who has to restrict his or her phosphorus intake to. Well, you have to think about what you're taking in, and also what you're not taking in as a result of what you're taking in. So one of the major controversies is whether juices, sodas, other things should be supplemented with vitamins or calcium or other things that children used to drink. And if children don't drink milk, which they need for, what else does milk have aside from calcium and phosphorus? Anybody know? So lots of vitamins, lots of protein, lots of vitamin D. And everyone's deficient in vitamin D. At least in San Francisco they are. Maybe less so in Palo Alto. Maybe I should move. Well, milk, for someone who's electrolyte depleted, milk is the simplest and probably most elegant replacement fluid. So if you see someone who's really depleted in many ways, say someone in the hospital with, who's just been washed out, say has had nothing but alcohol for the last, couple of weeks. Milk has a lot of sodium, a lot of potassium, a lot of phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, protein, vitamin D. It's a magnificent food source. But so if teenage girls who are in the midst of their greatest period of bone growth don't drink milk, and they don't get adequate phosphorus and calcium, they don't mineralize their bone as well, when they become postmenopausal women, they're the first ones who develop osteoporosis. So I think it's extremely important for children and adolescents and young adults who are still growing bone to not drink too much of this, because then they're not drinking other things that have other good stuff. 4 cans, there's a lot of caffeine in there too. Okay, so let's do 2 illustrative cases before we'll break for questions. We're doing okay time-wise? So a 32-year-old female engineer, and I didn't know you were going to raise this question, with no past medical history, decides to train for the Boston Marathon. She completes most of the race with relatively little difficulty, but she injures her ankle at mile 24. She completes the marathon and rehydrates after the finish line. She feels well but develops a headache on the trip home. Her partner finds her barely responsive at 11 p.m., hopefully responsible. She was hospitalized at Sequoia Hospital and develops a coma. And we don't want to talk about anyone getting a coma at Stanford, so. So her serum sodium concentration upon admission was 107 millimole per liter. If you needed one word to describe that, what word would you use? Hypo what? Hyponatremia, excellent. And the head CT, the head computed tomography, or the imaging of the head, shows diffuse brain swelling. Now you guys are so smart. Why is the brain swollen? So too much water and? Well, not enough sodium in the extracellular space, too much water in the extracellular space, permeable membranes, and transfer of water from the extracellular space to the intracellular space, leading to cell swelling. And she requires intubation and mechanical ventilation, meaning she basically was comatose. So why was the sodium 107? So she sweated a lot and lost some water. Okay. And why else? She drank water. Sodium went out in the sweat. So, that's a good hypothesis. That's a great hypothesis. It's a great hypothesis, but you don't lose that much, you don't lose in terms of the amount of sodium in our body and in our plasma volume. You don't lose that much salt when you sweat. You do lose salt, but you're actually losing a lot of water when you sweat, more water than salt. You do lose a little bit of salt when you sweat. That has made our colleagues at the University of Florida, in the Division of Nephrology, they have the largest endowment for nephrology-related research because of the development of Gatorade. Because people really, water is actually pretty perfect hydrating solution. Gatorade tastes good, and some people do cramp less and feel better, but water's pretty good. So, but why did the sodium get to 107? Someone said ankle. And so she injured her ankle and?
The baroreceptor said, saber-tooth tiger.
Well, that's another good hypothesis. That might have happened. So if, for instance, she went into shock after her marathon, or her blood pressure were very low, she could have had activation of her baroreceptors, and then she would have had an enhanced antidiuretic hormone. So as she was rehydrating, she would have reabsorbed more water in her, what's this called again? Collecting duct, right? So she would have absorbed more water. That's possible. But it's probably more likely, back to the other question which ties in back to we said lung or CNS or central nervous system disease. And I think anyone would say that completing a marathon would be a pretty massive stress, and injuring one's ankle at mile 24 of a marathon and completing another 2.5 miles with an injured ankle would be an intense stress. I can guarantee you that in about 12 seconds, my other phone in my other pocket's going to ring. Even though I told my wife and kids that I had a lecture to give tonight. So either brain injury or stress, severe stress, or lung disease can cause this syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. ADH gets activated and there's an overshooting, so that when she rehydrates with water, she dilutes her body. And probably the only way we could have figured that out is if someone were watching her to see if she were urinating. Now, we don't do experiments on medical students anymore. It's a very good thing Dr. Piezo has left the room. But years ago, I was told by a nephrologist who was conducting experiments on water balance that he was doing water infusion studies, that is, giving dextrose in water, not plain sterile water, we talked about why, but dextrose in water, and to see what the body's response would be and how much the sodium would drop and how dilute the urine could get under certain circumstances. And what he noticed was that there were a few medical students who were in the General Clinical Research Center who got so nervous when they were being stuck with a needle that their very ample urinary output shut down. And so it shut down because the urine, which was dilute, then that pre-urine, that filtrate, got reabsorbed. And that was a sign that there was inappropriate ADH secretion because that water was getting absorbed and not excreted. So we talked about why was the brain swollen. What might happen if this is not corrected quickly? Pardon me? So cell bursting could occur, but cell swelling is likely to occur in the brain. The cells don't burst the way blood cells burst. But if the brain swells in a closed cavity, that's a real problem. So the worst thing that can happen is something called herniation, where the brain swells, and because it can't move anywhere but out, it basically slides out the foramen in the neck. And it so happens that the portion of the brain that's near the spinal cord includes, and my wife is a neurologist, so I can talk a little bit about this because I don't know anatomy or neuroanatomy. I hope none of the neurosurgeons or neuroanatomists are listening. But the portions of the brain that are responsible for some of the vital functions come from the most primitive portions of the brain, the midbrain, the pons, and those are the portions of the brain that get basically squashed as the brain just swells and exits out the back. It's not the cortex, which is the thinking part, but the breathing, vital organs part, and people can die from brain swelling. And that's what probably happened to this marathoner in Chicago, and that's what happened to the woman who drank, I think it was a woman, I don't recall, who won the water or was participating in the water drinking contest. Now, it turned out that the woman in the water drinking contest who died wasn't the winner. She didn't drink the most water. So tell me two reasons why the woman who didn't, give me two possible reasons for why the woman who drank the most water wasn't the one who died. You guys are good. So so a bigger person is going to be able to dilute that extra water in a larger total body water space, so the concentration of sodium is going to drop less than in a petite person. And the other issue is people may have differential responses. Someone might get nauseated or might be nervous or might be excited because some, radio host is going to give them tickets to a concert or something, idiotic if they drink more fluids. And so it could be either body size or the body and the brain's response and the ADH status at the time. So how might you treat her using what you've learned tonight? How might you try to rescue her? Let's say her brain is swollen, she's really confused, she doesn't feel well, but she's not comatose, she isn't died, she hasn't herniated. How might you treat her? Pardon me? So, yeah, that would be one way. So one thing that you could do, you could give saline solution, the normal saline. Another thing that you might do, because this is such an extreme circumstance, is that you could give what's known as hypertonic saline. You could give an even more concentrated saline solution, because that would correct the imbalance faster. It might cause high blood pressure, but that's of limited consequence when your brain is about to slide out the back of the head. So you might give hypertonic saline. You might try to give something that would block the effects of ADH, a medication perhaps. If it were a chronic problem, and these levels of serum sodium can develop chronically in people and not acutely, like in the case of a marathon runner, and it turns out that we don't want to correct them abruptly if they've developed their condition slowly. And sometimes all we need to do is restrict the water intake and let it correct gradually on its own. So any of those things are possible therapeutic options. So that was a good case. Let's talk just before we close about what I might call, what used to be called renal osteodystrophy. And this shows you how intricate some of the balances are and how important the kidneys are, because when the kidneys aren't working, things can get out of balance and quick. So let's imagine a 67-year-old man with diabetes mellitus and progressive chronic kidney disease. He has a serum creatinine of 3.7 milligram per deciliter. I'll give you the reference range for the population of 0.7 to 1.1. That basically tells you that his glomerular filtration rate, this is the glomerulus, the filter, the rate, which is the amount of filtrate that gets filtered per minute per some corrected body size, is about 19 mLs per minute. Normal turns out to be about 120. And if you think about this for a minute, how spectacular the kidneys are. They filter about 180 liters of blood per day. Okay? So we talked today about what the volume, this brings everything together, what the volume of the blood is. So 180 liters per day, maybe 4.5 liters of blood. That'll, oh boy, I'm getting all these calls and texts. This is crazy. So anybody want to calculate that? 180 divided by 4.5, nice round number, 40. So that means that our blood is filtered in a day 40 times by our kidneys, if the kidneys are normal. And the body is so exquisite that we can live well and healthfully with, as I suggested to Dr. Piezo earlier, just a fraction of one kidney. We have a lot of redundancy in the system. But the kidneys must be really important if they filter the blood 40 times a day. I think there are things about the kidney that many things about the kidney we don't have a clue. Kidneys are probably contributing to a lot of things that we don't appreciate. We kind of think of them as, waste management systems. But they probably, we know they do a lot of other things. They modulate the immune system. They may attenuate the inflammatory process. People with kidney disease experience a whole host of diseases that some of which we understand well, some of which we don't. Having healthy kidneys is really important. This gentleman does not have healthy kidneys. He also happens to have hypertension, high blood pressure, hypercholesterolemia, and peripheral arterial disease, meaning some claudication or problems with circulation of the lower extremities. He also has a serum phosphorus of 6.3 milligram per deciliter, which is elevated, and a serum calcium of 8.1 milligram per deciliter, which is low. And the parathyroid hormone, those 4 glands atop the thyroid, is 873 picogram per milliliter, so it's more than 10 times the upper limit of the population reference range. So what do you think is happening here? Kidneys aren't working very well. And so what glands are trying their darndest to help the kidneys in that state? The parathyroid gland is helping. It's trying really hard. The phosphorus is high. Person's eating, but the phosphorus is high. So the kidneys have lost their capacity to maintain phosphorus balance. And so another safety mechanism has come into place, which is the parathyroid hormone level, which is trying to get the kidney to get rid of that extra phosphorus which is accumulating. That tells us something. Not only is sodium important and potassium important and calcium is important, but phosphorus must be important too. Because if the body is so unhappy at having a high phosphorus that it pushes these glands to go into overdrive. What happens with too much phosphorus? Well, it can deposit in bad places. So the patient then complains of bone and joint pain and muscle weakness because the parathyroid hormone is affecting the bones and the joints. He develops a foot ulcer, which is a very ominous sign in someone with diabetes and chronic infection, and an angiogram or an imaging study shows calcific arteriosclerosis, meaning that the blood vessels are calcified. So one of the consequences of high phosphorus is that it can basically, it's very interesting if you look at, it can basically produce bone in the blood vessels. If you look at an x-ray of a patient who has advanced kidney disease, you can basically see an outline of the aorta, the main artery supplying the body, because the blood vessel wall is full of bone. That's pretty scary. So the question is, what's out of balance? Well, the phosphorus and the calcium are out of balance. And how might we try to correct these metabolic abnormalities? So we now have a problem. The body wasn't designed to develop kidney failure. And when we were running from saber-toothed tigers, we weren't dealing with dialysis and transplant. So we have this problem of dystrophic or misplaced calcification. It's not going in the bones, it's going in the blood vessels. How do we try to treat that? There are now 3 or 4 things are out of balance. Any ideas? Think logically. Think about your pantry. Think about what we've talked about since the start of the evening. Pardon me? Less processed food. Well, if that processed food is less processed food, if that processed food is Cheese Whiz or something you can tell I went to college in Philadelphia. No one knows about Cheese Whiz in San Francisco. It doesn't exist here. It's been outlawed. But yeah, it's something that's high in phosphorus. You try to reduce your intake of something high in phosphorus so as to reduce the workload of the kidneys to try to get rid of the phosphorus, make it a little bit easier. So that would be one thing that you might try to do. Just take in less phosphorus. There's a limit to your dietary restriction because phosphorus is in a lot of foods, but you could quit drinking soda. You could quit eating ice cream. It tastes good, but it has very little nutritional value. You can stop eating cheese. Anything else that you might try? Think, how many of you are engineers? I mean, we live in like the engineering capital of the world. So I want an engineer to tell me another way that we could help correct these metabolic abnormalities. No, that's too easy. And actually, that doesn't work that well, interestingly enough, for phosphorus. Think creatively. Drink more. How would that help? Yeah, so drinking more wouldn't improve the way the kidney gets rid of phosphorus. I don't think that would help. Very interesting. So what's responsible for phosphorus absorption? So I'm going to help you there. So how about interrupting phosphorus absorption? How might you do that? So a case of beer. I don't think a case of beer might make you not care about your phosphorus. So there is no real antiphosphorus, unless I'm not sure what you're talking about, antiphosphorus, or what you mean. But well, you could, if phosphorus is being absorbed from food, how about interrupting the absorption of phosphorus? So you might do something, for instance, that's a good hypothesis, that might coat the stomach or the intestinal tract, help prevent the absorption of phosphorus. It turns out that the absorption of phosphorus is an active process, and you could inhibit the channels and the processes that absorb phosphorus. Or you could do something much simpler, which is just bind up the phosphorus. So take something with your food that soaks up the phosphorus and lets it go out in the stool before it ever goes into the bloodstream. That's a very simple, crude, they're called phosphate binders. And they're a very important component of our treatment of people with advanced kidney disease. And so let me just to give you, so my friend, the stress lady, yes. You have a question? I'm referring to my friend as the stress lady because she asked a question about stress.
Can that be done through types of food that you eat as opposed to medications?
Possibly, but with great difficulty. So phosphorus, I will tell you, is negatively charged. So you might take something that's positively charged. And there are several positively charged binders that we use. The types of binders don't matter so much, but you can take something that's positively charged that will bind to the phosphorus. You then eliminate the phosphorus in the bloodstream. It doesn't get absorbed. That's one way of helping correct the metabolic abnormalities. Another way would be to figure out something that would help improve the kidney function. That's a tough one here because it's very advanced, and diabetes-related kidney disease tends to be progressive. Or you could do something like dialysis or hemofiltration. Yes?
What would be a phosphate binder? More calcium?
Well, calcium, like Tums or calcium salts, are effective phosphate binders. Aluminum salts are effective phosphate binders. There's a rare earth metal known as lanthanum, which is basically what they wrap your cable wire with. But there's a medication that's made out of lanthanum. If you would like to try that, I can write you a prescription. Anyway, this is, we care for 350,000 patients in the United States who have end-stage renal disease and are on dialysis, and another 150,000 people or so with end-stage renal disease who have functional transplants. And I can tell you that dialysis is a marvelous life-saving therapy, but it sustains life. It does not restore health. Let me tell you a figure which is very disturbing. There are over 100,000 persons in the United States each year who start dialysis. Now, what does that tell you? Pardon me? Well, so that says, my friend from Chicago says that we'll probably have a large fraction of the population on dialysis. And you would be correct if we could just get it right. If we could actually restore people's health and sustain their life not for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years, but for a long time. So the problem is if 100,000+ people start dialysis each year, but the prevalent population of people on dialysis is only 350,000, that's telling you that a large fraction of those patients are dying every year. And I bet you, I've been pretty lighthearted today, and we've been chatting and having jokes and teasing Dr. Piezo and everything, but this is serious business, and when the kidneys aren't working well, it's a pretty horrible disease. Mortality rates for people with end-stage kidney disease exceed those of people with metastatic prostate cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, AIDS. It's not quite as bad as leukemia, but it's about 20% per year in the United States. So 1 in 5 patients who are on dialysis will die each year. And we're at a point now where the life expectancy of most patients on dialysis does not exceed the waiting time for a kidney transplant. So even if people, more often than not, people will die before they ever get a chance to get a kidney transplant. So a couple of parting messages. If any of you have any relatives or friends with kidney disease, it's serious business. And if any of you want to help increase the public knowledge about kidney disease, there are a lot of very active public organizations, the National Kidney Foundation, the American Association of Kidney Patients, the American Kidney Fund. We're much smaller than the American Heart Association or the National Cancer Society, but this is a very, very severe disease. It tends to affect kidney failure, meaning it tends to affect racial and ethnic minorities disproportionately. Blacks account for roughly 30 to 35% of patients on dialysis, but only about 13% of the US population, so hugely disproportionate fraction of African Americans and other Black Americans on dialysis. And in our region, also what's also very relevant is that Asians and Pacific Islanders, American Indians, South Asians from the Indian subcontinent, and Latinos are also at increased risk for progressive kidney disease. So it's very serious business. If any of you have any friends who would like to endow an Institute for Kidney Disease Research, I'm sure that Dr. Gillum and I can talk with you about that after the meeting. You have a question up top.
You said it would be nice if you could get it right. If you could distribute it widely, the whole population, 3 to 5 rules,
Well, so that's a really good question. When I said we have to get it right, I mean we have to get dialysis right. Because what we're basically doing is and I think it again speaks to how exquisite and magnificent the kidneys are, because we're doing a lot with dialysis of what we understand the kidneys to do, yet people feel poorly and have foreshortened life expectancy. So there must be a whole host of other good, healthy things that healthy kidneys do that keep people healthy and alive that we just haven't figured out with dialysis because our membranes they're not living membranes. So I think you're alluding to the fact that prevention would be the best treatment. So avoiding uncontrolled diabetes and uncontrolled hypertension would be important if there's a family history of kidney disease. Investigating that and understanding that and trying to understand rarer causes of kidney disease. And fortunately, most of the other healthy lifestyle recommendations tend to work and prevent kidney disease and kidney disease progression. The irony of it is that the better and better we get at treating cardiovascular disease, and I see a number of people in the audience older than I who probably remember either their generation or the generation preceding when men dying in their 50s of a heart attack was not uncommon. Happened all the time. That doesn't happen very often now because our therapies for cardiovascular disease are so much better. I'll finish in a sec. But the longer we keep people alive and they don't die from their heart attacks and their heart failure, particularly with progressive diabetes, they may develop kidney disease. And so all of our therapies that we're prescribing to try to slow progression of kidney disease and reduce the number of people who end up on dialysis may be so successful at extending their life that they may end up needing dialysis in the future rather than falling prey to their cardiovascular disease. I'll let Dr. Gillum tell me if we can take any other questions.
First, thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.